So I'll just get right into it. So my understanding today is we were sort of asked about trying to share some experiences of how our program has unfolded over the years at D&D and sort of where we're at sort of now in terms of some significant or noteworthy client activities that we're doing. So with that, I'll just go through the deck. I think the deck was distributed, so it'll be available to people to have a chance to look at. And I'm not one for reading points per point off the deck, so invite you to look at it and then hear our discussion and then ask questions at the end. So the DEA program, so D&D was probably, I'll say, one of the first adopters formally for enterprise architecture amongst the federal departments. Probably mitigated or probably driven rather by the need for having there's massive systems in terms of the scale and scope, and there's a lot of complexity to those systems and services and programs, and so the need to interoperate even within the military from the different environments, Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as interoperate with our allies, with NATO, with NORAD. So that's probably that probably was the main drivers on why we were probably one of the pioneers in embracing EA as a practice. So we currently report to the VCDS, and we're in the process of potentially, well, it's not potentially, it's imminent. We're going to be moving to our new transformation office, our new ADM level transformation program. And we understand that's probably a common service for a common trend that we're seeing in terms of other federal departments, and where architecture is being very closely linked to transformation. So the next slide I'm showing here is really our framework, and we have what we call the DINDAF, the D&D Architecture Framework, and it was, I think, initially derived from the Department of Defense Architecture Framework, since we obviously work very closely with our allies to the south of us. And for the most part, the best thing I want to do, if everybody hasn't heard of this already, is we basically there's hundreds, if not thousands, of models or variations of models, and so we've tried to pick a subset of those so that we would have a more common design language. And we've created what we call views, which is a collection of different models that hopefully, through the process of doing the due diligence on how you would describe the main drivers and interests of any system, by going through all of those different views, you're able to basically provide a complete architecture picture. So that's as much as I would want to get into that for this deck, but we offer a training session on the DINDAF when new contractors who may be very experienced architects come into the department. It's a process for them to get indoctrinated into, I'll say, a bit of the D&D flavor. So in terms of the program implementation approach, I'll give everyone a bit of a history lesson on the formation of the enterprise architecture program in defense. So like many enterprises, the architecture program was born out of the CIO or IMIT department. And I'm assuming that as systems started to advance in complexity and maturity, the need to organize the solution design aspects gave way to the need to have enterprise architecture. And that was very much the focus way back in the early 2000s. And that led to creating the architecture framework, which is where we leveraged, again, working with our allies, working off the Department of Defense, working off of NATO, and the DINDAF was created in the latter part of the 2000s, 2007 timeframe. And then a few years after that, I think we were one of the first, if not the first, departments to get an enterprise level tool set in terms of QualiWare to basically try to run this on a more enterprise scale versus traditionally using drawing tools like Visio or Sparks or some other modeling tools. So, which I think set the stage for having Treasury Board look for that take up across other federal departments. So, D&D, I think, does have that sort of feather in its cap as sort of being one of the pioneers for an enterprise-wide solution and propagating QLM as an enterprise tool set. Now, by 2013, and this was the trend that I would say denotes why this move happened, is I think more and more of enterprise architecture modeling was getting, I'll say, advancing beyond simply, I'll say, the solution space, and was more about, as we've referred to it, bridging the strategy and the execution. And so we were getting more and more strategic layered architecture modeling as an effort. And as part of that, there was a move to move the DEA out of the CIO and into the VCDS, the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, which is basically sort of the policy sort of center of gravity, sort of the second in command, if you will, to the Chief of Defense Staff. And that happened in the 2013 or thereabouts. And by 2019, that meant we had more program, I'll say, advancement, where we were being a little more, we were advancing the program, we were trying to expand its mandate. We formalized it in what are called defense order and directives, DOADs. And so that sort of identified, in essence, almost a charter of what people should be doing in order to advance the program throughout the department. And at that point, it became the idea of it being almost like another type of professional management practice, just like you would do human resource management, or you would do financial management, you would do enterprise architecture. So we also have had a roadmap that we've been published, and that includes moving over to the transformation office. So that's kind of the time frame. So the real thrust of that is to show the path of, this was born out of maybe organizing the solution and the implementation aspects, and it's advanced to be more of a drop down, a bridge between the strategic planning and business planning functions. And so this next slide builds on that theme, and this is very much derived from many of my colleagues here on the line. People are TOGAF certified. This is very much a piece of the TOGAF framework, where I've seen certain architects kind of argue amongst themselves about saying, "Oh, you're just a whiteboard architect. You're not a real architect. You don't architect solutions." And I think what TOGAF has been good at articulating is it's all architecture. It's just at different levels and at different layers. So we have the strategic, and then the project, and the segment kind of combines those two, or bridges those two, is how I tend to think about it. So whiteboard architecture is still architecture. It's still a way of trying to make plans consumable and being able to then provide a logic framework to map your solutions delivery back to the plans, give you better coverage to understand how you're delivering on your plans. In terms of the D&D corporate planning process, we have a planning process which it's based on mapping capabilities, and then there is a status, a standard set of dimensions that people are meant to look at in terms of infrastructure, cost, engineering. So there's these standard dimensions where you would look at a capability from a non-solution, a solution agnostic approach. A capability, I would think of it as being a prerequisite. You define your capability and the need for a capability, and then that would be the preface into starting to do any requirements definition. If there is a investment decision made that we should pursue getting that capability, whether that capability needs to be updated, if it's an existing capability, or if there's a gap, if there's a deficiency. So we have, as part of our gating process, one of the first things that you would do as a precursor to initiating a project is to do a capability deficiency description. And then that would create the need to bridge that capability. The output of project deliverables are what we would refer to as building blocks. And you could have a building block, one or more building blocks coming out of projects. And I think from our perspective, from the enterprise architecture program, we try to think about deliverables as being very much how can they be reused across different solution spaces. So we're hoping to have less one-off building blocks and more building blocks that are reusable. And each one of these planning cycles, I mean, we have an annual planning cycle, we would have a multi-year planning cycle, we have what's called the capability-based plan, which is typically updated or republished every 3 to 5 years. So that's the different planning horizons. Those are in essence aligned to where we would tend to try to have architecture roadmaps that would show the interim or the evolving architectures through each of those different planning solutions. So this is really trying to describe how we have basically started to really slowly fuse and weave together a fabric of planning and then architecture at the strategic level being the other side of that, which is then elaborated on in terms of segment and solution architectures. So if we look at this slide, and I'll build this slowly just to build a little bit of suspense, we sort of look at what we call the lines of inquiry, which is sort of how the different views were orchestrated. This goes all the way back to the initial architecture, enterprise architecture framework type stuff, giving a nod to, say, Zachman with the questions, right? So I kind of humorously said that architects are a bit like investigative journalists, right? So they ask all the main questions, the eternal questions. And then from that, you basically want to answer those in the form of the models of the architecture that you're portraying. We have basically, the DEA has this, what we call transformation cycle, which is inform, decide, and transform, which is about basically trying to increase, if we think of planning as being both a bottom-up and a top-down process that coexists and sort of should align at a certain level when they fuse and meet in the middle. We think of inform and decide and transform as a bit of a rotary engine. And so what we try to describe is EA being a process that can accelerate that rotary engine and in essence then create agility in the organization. And that's done again by weaving together at different layers of architecture from the strategic, the segment, and the project layer. So what you see here on this slide is basically we have a bit of a enterprise context model, which is how we show how there's the planning, the top-down planning, policy driving, change being driven from the outside in terms of the mandate from the public and from our ministry. And then the bottom-up planning, which is often very much rooted in here's what we can do, here's the art of the possible. We're often being asked to do more than we have resources for. And so the bottom-up planning shows what is the art of the possible. And the other main component of this slide is what we're seeing as enterprise architecture as our program has evolved, that the term enterprise is very much a context sensitive and a situation dependent reference. So the enterprise may or may not always be national defense, or it might be the federal government. It may in fact be a nation, a League of Nations in terms of our allies, in terms of being part of NATO. A big push from operations and lessons learned from things like Afghanistan and other operations is the need to have what is called interoperability at day zero, so that the moment we have international operations with our allies, that we're able to operate as one force right from the start. And so that means thinking of those organizations as well as part of almost a larger enterprise that we fit in part of. So the DEA does have a role where we coordinate with colleague nations through working groups in NATO. We meet with them about between 4 and 6 times a year to come up with framework updates and standards to try and make sure that interoperability is encouraged, increased, enhanced, and optimized as part of next generation solutions. So this shows just in any given context, the enterprise can include, it could even include different public forum in terms of the operating environment that we're looking at. It could include different levels of government if we're dealing with a pan-departmental initiative, or in the case of, for example, even any relief effort or disaster relief where we're working to support provincial governments through something like, I don't know, forest fires or something like that. So in those different cases, we try to say, okay, what's the context of the enterprise? So one of the other, I'll say, key pieces, and this has probably been something that has evolved, I'll say, in the last 5 years, 7 years, um, through our leadership, is a lot of, I'll say, very traditional enterprise architecture doctrine is very much about being compliance-based. Are you aligned with the architecture? And what we're realizing now is that the environment is where, because we have so many different um, almost ecosystems that we have to work within between different enterprises, whether it's working with NORAD, working with NATO, working across the federal government, which is very TOGAF dependent. We have NATO has its own NATO architecture framework. And in fact, even different nations are at different versions or generations of the NATO architecture framework. We understand and have to accept that there is still value with enterprise architecture, but working within what I would call a heterogeneous framework environment. So that means trying to de-emphasize on compliance to any one framework, but looking at the best among them and understanding that these all have common content elements. And so we try to take a greater emphasis on content. And it's not about whether things comply or not comply to a standard. But we try to now think of it more as degrees of alignment. And that's pretty consistent with what we're seeing even with a lot of, Treasury Board submission review processes and authorization processes. It's less about whether or not a project is approved or not approved, but they will often now not just simply give approval. There will be a lot of conditions and guidance with an approval, which become things to monitor as the project evolves. And that's how we look at it in terms of architectures. So when we have major projects that have a number of initiatives that have to interoperate across sister projects or other in-service capabilities, architecture is there, and it's providing that altimeter to say, here's what we're seeing, here's the degree of alignment. There could be a few, yellow flags, there could be a few orange flags, and that becomes a due diligence exercise that leadership can make an informed decision on. So we've kind of have a mantra at the DEA is we're basically coaches, not cops. We've used the analogy internally that we're a bit like fitness instructors. We try to give projects the the plan that they would want to adopt if they want to have, I'll say, the optimal conditions for the best type of architecture content. And we sort of then help provide a bit of an outside view on how well that's going relative to some of the other projects and be able to report on that to management. So again, this slide is moving away from forcing one way. We have to deal with NATO projects that could be using the NATO architecture framework. And even though we have our own architecture framework, and we would say that that is our de facto standard, we have to recognize that we're going to be drawing from aspects from other frameworks, or even the TOGAF dealing across other federal departments. So again, we try not to think of it as right or wrong. We try to think of it as degrees of alignment. We try to think of it as even being across different solution domains. I mean, we also are we have our ERP solutions like other federal departments, and then some of the major ERP providers like SAP will have their own sort of architecture frameworks baked into their COTS solutions. And so we can't simply force these people to abandon that aspect of the COTS solution. We have to embrace it. So everything we refer to it then as patterns. And so we want to make sure that we can overlay the patterns and look for the parallel structures in those patterns. Even in some respects, being unstructured, we almost sort of humorously say is that is the pattern, is that it's unstructured. So emphasizing more on the strategic pieces of work we've been doing of late, we've been working with a few of our clients here. The Chief of Force Development is actually the group that we have been residing with under the Vice Chief of Defense Staff. And that in essence is kind of our I'm trying to think of the best analogy, but it's kind of our not our R&D group, but certainly I would say that the leadership team that sort of fuels advancement. The main program line item in our report to the ministry is about being the future force, defining the future force. So they look at it from a mid to long-term perspective, more out like at the 7, 10, 15-year mark in terms of what, are we on the right trajectory to get to that point? Recognizing that it's a journey that from our perspective, we never reach because you do the planning update every 3 to 5 years. And as a result, that trajectory, you're confirming if you're on the right trajectory, but you never quite get there because then there's a new far off horizon that you're basically trying to pursue. So we've been working on looking at the planning process and the capability-based planning process with that, looking at the latest trends in planning in terms of, I'll say, digital transformation, like thinking of planning less as a 3 to 5 year cycle and more of as an ongoing process, and having planning to be able to be done on a more on-demand process. If people are familiar with some of the concepts of digital twinning, for example, the idea of creating a meta model or a data fabric and being able to weave all your planning information in so that if you have something that is introduced to the situation that's new, like COVID that sort of came out of nowhere, how would that affect your planning, and being able to run that through your planning models and come up with some assessments of changing funding, changing priorities, changing resource allocations. How does that affect your long-term horizon? So we've been working with the Chief of Force Development to model out processes to lend itself to more of a fluid planning process. NORAD modernization, I've been working with the NORAD modernization team for about a year now. So we are sort of in pre-startup. In Treasury Board terms, we're in pre-PA. It is a stated priority for the new minister that's come in the last few weeks or month or two. And interoperability is very much key, and basically trying to come up with a much more agile approach. There's been a lot of analysis and a lot of case studies done on the Russian-Ukraine conflict and how lessons learned about how sheer brute force and sheer power is potent, but what can be even more potent is agility and being able to have faster decision cycles and more informed decisions more quickly. So we kind of refer to that as being a bit of the decision advantage. So how do we get the decision advantage in terms of military operations? So we've been working on a systems mindset and different capabilities to complement and modernize what we call the C2 systems, the command and control systems. So to the layman, how I best try to describe that is, if anyone on the line here, hopefully, probably one of the first movies we all watched coming out of COVID was Top Gun 2. It was like a really big hit. So the systems that kind of showed the mission and how they had to do the mission, flying the plane through sort of the mountains and then up over a really steep mountain and then down into a crater and then hitting a spot that's like one building wide over 2 miles away. This whole system that sort of showed how you could model a mission is part of what we would call sort of a C2 system. So, and the last one we're looking at is CCSI. So as part of the need for more interoperability, there's been a new organization that's been created under the Vice Chief of Defense Staff that has spun out part of the Chief of Force Development and a few other aspects from IMIT and others, and it's called the Combat Systems Integration Chief. So that's the Chief of Combat Systems Integration. So they have been looking at the whole state of literally several hundred systems and looking to figure out how we just ratchet up interoperability almost at an exponential pace. How do we do that? So they look at it, they are looking to ramp up with a major architecture push that will probably have easily, I'm guessing, but they'll probably have anywhere from 25 to 50 architects over the next a few years ramp up to basically do that sort of segment layer architecture, if you remember that from the earlier slides, which is how do things bridge together across all of the combat systems. And so they're working very closely with DEA. They've been almost right nipping at DEA's heels on how can we start using the enterprise features and capabilities of our tool set of QualiWare in order to make that happen. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Basically, the message is that we work very much from a design perspective, but in the last few years, it's been much more of, I think, a strategic focus on the enterprise architecture work, which is not at the expense of the work we've been doing. It's just adding to the menu or adding to the capability. Vince, any comments or questions? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I would just, you're sharing me, I think, Chris, on your
All
screen.
right, I'm going to get off sharing now.
We can, there we go. We can share the screen side by side. Yeah, so thanks for that quick overview of where we're focused these days, where we came from. That's not to say, as you said, that there isn't a lot of other focus work in the past. You know, I noticed Kevin Wilson and Par, who were on the line today, certainly from a policy management perspective in the material management space. These are still things we're continuing to support. But what I wanted Chris to highlight for the group today is sort of what's the trajectory? Where are we going? What is, as you said, nipping at our heels in terms of who's asking new for services? And it's really a lot about digital transformation, integration of existing systems and future capabilities online, and a big worry that there's huge investments happening that are not necessarily synchronized with each other. And so, you know, there's investments and projects and things going like that that could be working at cross purposes, and the senior leadership doesn't have a good handle on what that might look like. So that's where enterprise architecture seems to be being pulled, is to answer those particular questions. I think it's important for the group to note, you know, you can see maybe from some of the smaller departments that our approach to EA is a little bit different. You know, we're not a centralized shop doing the corporate architecture top down, or certainly we've migrated out of the MIT space, not to say that there aren't architects working in that space, but, you know, from a programmatic aspect into more of a CEO or a COO function. And we're very much a service offering, sort of internal consultancy kind of approach. So that characterizes the EA program at D&D that might be different from some other shops, but it certainly marks the sort of evolution of where we've gotten to today compared to where we were in the past. So I invite anybody to make any comments or ask any questions.
I see a hand up. I can't see who it is because it's.
Oh, it's Kevin Wilson. All right,
okay.
Go ahead, Kevin.
There we go, Kevin. Are you on mute, Kevin? We can't hear you.
Kevin had problems earlier.
Oh, we can't. And maybe if you type out your question on the discussion thread, we can't hear you.
Or shout really loud.
Oh, maybe we could deal with that secretarially later. We could follow up.
I think Kevin's typing this question. If anybody else has
oh,
any,
wonderful.
Feel free to fire them off.
Excellent.
I have a question in the meantime. Hi. Very nice story. Very, very entertaining, actually, for all the EA passionate folks out there. There was a slide where you said we're staying away from frameworks and requirements. And my question to you is, how do you capture the enterprise requirements? Like, do you have a central repository, you know, that aligns with the TOGAF, and also the GCA framework for each domains? Do you have any advice, perhaps, to shed on this?
Yeah, so some of our situations, that's a good question, actually, and very pertinent, I think, for this community, where you're going to have differences between, I'll call it an integrated enterprise architecture versus a federated one. One of the challenges we face is that, and I've been with DA for a long time, so I know the story very well. But back in the early 2000s, we weren't going to get, the Army and the Navy and the Air Force to agree on one standard. We weren't going to get them to agree that something had to be done in a singular kind of way. So when you look at D&D, it's very big in terms of the numbers of industries that we're engaged in. I mean, it's 100,000. There's lots of companies that are bigger than that, but we are in food services, we're in health services, we're in dental. There's legal, there's all the security branches that we have. We've got material management, supply chain, housing, right? Each of these things are bound by the standards that exist outside their organizations, the norms, the practices, the guides. And so how do you bring everybody into one place? So what Chris was talking about is we actually have to adapt these things as, yes, testing is working. I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. So we'll finish this one and then I'll get back to you, Kevin. So what we had to do is look at how we bring all these different things together. And so we've had to be very flexible. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we use QualiWare, is because we can adapt that meta model on the fly. Like once you lock the meta model into the database, you're not bound to it. You can modify it and add things as you go. So what it means is we can, and this is happening with our Chief of Combat Systems integration team that Chris was talking about. We're engaged with them and they're bringing a whole bunch of things in to say, well, we need this. And so we can look at those things and try and figure out, well, do we have something already that can answer the mail on that? Or do I need to adapt something and bring something in so they can now capture that information? There's pushback too, as Kevin Wilson can attest to over the many years that he and I have been working on this different stuff. And so we absorb some things and then sometimes we push back on it as well and say, well, we can do it this way as well. So you have to balance those different things. And certainly one of the challenges we've got going on is framework. Like there's the TOGAF, which is Government of Canada. There's elements in the UK that are using that to support the NATO architecture framework, but there are a lot of other countries that are using the unified architecture framework out of the OMG or the old DODAF from the US. There's a 1.0, 1.5, and a 2. So they use those different ones. Where are we with that? It sort of becomes very much a centralized effort around the project that you're working on. So Federated Mission Network, which is an initiative that grew out of the time in Afghanistan where all the nations had to come together and try and create a backbone that worked. There were a lot of lessons learned there. And so there's actually an active NATO effort to create the Federated Mission Networking as an initiative with an architecture. Well, that's a collaboration. So everybody comes together and you adopt the standard within the confines of that particular project. So it's very much a federated approach where different projects and different areas of the business will bring their standards. And then you have to do translation. You got to speak between them and try and see weaving together the most critical points as opposed to everything. So that's the difference between a federated versus an integrated architecture. I don't know if that answers your question.
That is a very good answer. Thank you very much.
I would add, and this is what I see coming at it, seeing Vince sort of with the gray hairs or whatever that he probably got over the years, it's like a typical product life cycle. So if you looked at our timeline slide when we had the early 2000s, the focus was just getting people in, getting people to buy in to do it, right? I mean, it's like trying to get the first person to buy a fax machine. How do you get the power of all this modeling? The first person goes, I model this, no one else can even understand them, and there's nothing else to link to, so what's the point of modeling it, right? So Vince and his team, way back before I was even there, or a lot of our current people, they're focusing on just getting people to buy into it, right? But then by the time the framework started to come out and the latter part of the 2000s, you're focused on now you've got a market, right? They were successful in getting, I think, almost 2,000 accounts created, different models, but different accounts. There's all these different workspaces because people wanted to have their own private workspace. And then he focuses on how do we start to build the franchise, right? How do we now create a mature product? The product has penetrated the market, but now how do you get the uptakes? And then you get that sort of horizontal alignment. And so then the focus fixed on more common views. And even the last major upgrade, going back, 4 or 5 years now, was almost 2 years or a bit more in the making because Vince was brutal about trying to get all the L1s to consolidate to at least just 1 or 2 workspaces within their ADM level. Never mind thinking of getting one for the department, but we moved from a major, it was almost what, 2,000 different workspaces or 200 down to like
No,
a
we
handful.
we had 250 repositories, and we've consolidated that down to less than 20, but it's not a single one. Like, it's still multiple areas. And I would say that that's because of the size and the types of industries that we're engaged in. And I would say, if you don't have to do that, don't do that. Like, you know, if you can be integrated, you should try and do that. But it was certainly a challenge for us. So we had to have a different approach to that.
And that was 20 years ago versus now. Now, if a department was starting now, you would hope that because the practice within the government, the uptake across all departments, the guidance from Treasury Board will hopefully mean they wouldn't have to start the same way Vince did back in the early 2000s, right? Because you kind of start a little bit faster in because you're saying, well, let's learn from everyone else, not start at square one. Let's start at square 10 or 15 down the road, right? If that makes any sense.
Okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. And to just segue into the next question, Kevin Wilson, I'll just flag, as one of those guys back in the thousands, you know, those early adopters. Kevin's been working for a long time with us. So Kevin, over to you for a question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, Mike, I put the question in the chat there, but I'll just do a bit of a preamble. We one of the biggest impediments for us in ADM MAT was having a kind of a persistent architecture practice develop, and it was often based, like, it was really, and I've said this more of the times than once, a feast or famine, depending on the interests of management to develop the practice or not. A lot of skepticism on the value of it. It wasn't until our group finally identified a level 1 advisor for architecture that we started seeing the possibility of getting some kind of cohesive governance in. And it's been very slow going because the people who've been delegated this as are also very busy in other areas, but there's some promise there that there'll be effective controls put into place and make this more as part of the business rather than a nice to have. So really my question is that, how's it going with the other groups? Are they what state are they in terms of this?
I think, and this is, you know, for the rest of the assembly, try and hear the conversation as opposed to the specific items, but the MAT group certainly is, I think, out in the fore when it comes to that element. You've got at least a recognition amongst your different sub enterprises that this is something you need to collaborate on, and you need to have some governance process around it. Most of the rest of the organization is still learning about EA, and you've got individual lines of business who are trying to push forward with their domain. And it's part of both the plus and the minus of the way we set up the enterprise architecture program, to be a service offering, to be inclusive, and to be something where we could pull people in. Participation was more important than enforcement. That's a symptom of that. What am I saying? I'm saying that you guys are still out in front. And that being said, the Chief of Combat Systems integration is going to be propelling that more at the enterprise level, simply because of the role that they play. So we're looking at partnering with them to sort of push the issue of governance at an L0 level, at an enterprise level, to say we're going to need more of this. We already have in the information management group, now called the CIO group, within D&D, a process of getting in front of the GC Enterprise Architecture Review Board, where any IMIT project has to go in front of the CIO internal shop before going to the CIO at Treasury Board, and they are required to produce 4 of the views of the DINDAF. So there's a mandatory 4 views. Those 4 views get reviewed by the CIO shop to move forward, for the projects to move forward. But that's at the project level. Now what we're talking about with CCSI is an integrated approach to looking at systems, at least the combat systems. And so capability development will all have to be brought into the space where which gates are going to be needed, which views are going to be needed, how to set that up. So that conversation is actually just currently happening. We've also engaged with the project approval courses. We're now engaged in briefing those courses on enterprise architecture and how the project directors, for example, have to be cognizant of EA and realize that that project level is, Chris had that slide up with the three colored bands. The project level is often where all the horsepower is for developing architecture. You don't have a lot of horsepower in the line organizations. You, Kevin, are a little bit of an exception in that way, but most of the time the architecture comes out of the projects. So trying to get more of that governance related to the project approval tied to the money so that we can build that, get a little closer to the integrated view compared to the federated approach we've got so far. So that's where we're at today.
Just a follow-on question. You have DoD and there's an enforcement component to that, but I think I also heard that you don't want to be like the policeman. So I think about, for example, the major crown projects where they're building the large scale weapon systems. They don't seem to be very much engaged in the architecture, though I have, they're part of our kind of community practice within the group. Like, do you see any value in approaching those guys to discuss further what benefits there could be?
Yeah, for sure. And there's certainly some very, very big billion-dollar projects in D&D that are going to need to be paying attention to this. DEA as a team is the coach, not cop. The cop aspect has to come with enterprise governance. And there's a ton of governance bodies inside the organization that already do this governance. What we want to be able to do is arm them with the information and then have, chief of force development say, no, that we don't need that capability because it overlaps here and we've got duplication. We don't have to do that in the enterprise architecture cell. We're just enabling the governance bodies that are in the organization to do that. And so that's where our talks with CCSI to get them enabled to be able to do that. And they will act as those cops. They will act as those integrators. We don't have to do that in the enterprise architecture. Oh, I see Tamara, which means we're probably running over on time.